about targeting civilians by the Houthi militia is a war crime against humanity. The Houthi militia has continued to target civilians directly through their missiles or by converting civilians' facilities into military sites. The Houthi insist on militarizing civilians' facilities, using them to the store weapons and launching explosive rallies to target the other Yemeni cities that is not under their control or neighboring countries. For the past 60 years, civilians have been the main victims of the war. Therefore, the production of civilians direct armed conflict is the cornerstone of the international humanitarian law. This protection extends to the public and private civil property. The international humanitarian law also defines as the protect the most vulnerable group of the civilians, such as women, children, and displaced. It is as if the Houthi militiamen are happy with the mounting of civilians casualties. It is flagrant violations of the international laws and the conventions. We argue the international community, United Nations, UN, and US envoys to Yemen to condemn those insane crime and all tourist Houthis malicious crime, pressure malicious leaders to stop their daily crimes and violations against civilians and to work to redesignate militias as a terrorist group. Today we have three speakers that going to talk about those targeting civilians by the Houthis militia. We can start with Mr. Matthew Robinson, the Director of European Gulf Information Center.
Hello, good evening, and thank you so much for the invitation and being able to join this distinguished panel. It's a pleasure to join you this evening from our headquarters in Rome, Italy. Before I dive into my remarks, I just wanted to share very briefly about our center. EGIC, the Eurogov Information Center, has prioritized a single goal: to advance understanding of the Gulf through dialogue and engagement. And the work undertaken in pursuit of that is based on constructing socio-political, strategic, cultural, and economic communities composed both of Europeans and people from the Arabian Gulf. A bit about me. Before I joined EGIC as director, I spent 7 years working as an advisor in the European Parliament to a British Conservative Party delegation. And one of the reasons why this topic is of so much interest to me is that I, having grown up in Northern Ireland, I'm acutely aware of, granted in a different geographical context, but of the sensitivities growing up in a conflict sectarian zone and area, with the heightened pressures that offers both to the people, to the political classes, beyond that, it's important as a starting point, I think, before looking at anything else, to stamp out and have a zero tolerance for terrorism. Is the second you give any organization with reckless and terrorizing objectives even this much space, they'll exploit it and not for the betterment of the people that they claim to represent. Now going on to just some of my observations for this topic today. At EGIC, we really strive to contribute to early warning to stakeholders about lurking dangers on strategic and political levels. And with this exact point, I'd like to address you today on these warnings. I'm not here to talk per se about Ansar Allah. Rather, I'm here to discuss the dangers of having removed the Houthis from terrorist designation lists, allowing even rewarding Iran for its regional behavior, and identifying what comes next from a Euro-Gulf perspective. It was predicted that Biden would try and undo many of the labors of the Trump administration, in part because of ideological reasons, and in part because of new pressures and lobbies at work in the Biden camp. Perhaps it was not Biden himself, but he promised a new era of US engagement in the Middle East, and removing the Houthis from the terror designation list seemed like an easy way to prove himself, while in essence providing a confidence-building measure to Iran, the Houthi incubator. This plan spectacularly backfired. As so often when dealing with terrorists and insurgency groups, rewarding them without having to make concessions only serves to empower and legitimate them. For the Houthis, it is not a coincidence that its operational aggression has increased dramatically, and it now includes the UAE's capital, Abu Dhabi, on its target list. The key problem is the Yemen people are not cared for under the Houthi regime. Horrible crimes against humanity are being conducted. At the same time, the Vienna talks over the JCPOA have continued, with the US providing sanctions waivers as carrots without the requisite sticks. This is translated into increased Iranian pressure tactics by its many proxies, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, and in fact throughout the region, and the Houthis in Yemen. Their modus operandi, their MO, is the same. Target civilians using insurgent tactics, and once the population was scared enough, impose strict religious rules on them in order to limit resistance. In the case of Yemen, the Houthis have gone one step further and have created a system of internal denunciation, just like the Soviets used to do. Brothers are encouraged to denounce their sisters and children their parents. This system of instituting fear as a tactic means that even when the scourge of the Houthis is gone, defeated, it'll take generations of social healing to move beyond the horrors that have been inflicted on Yemen. This is just the tip of the iceberg, my friends. So, on that positive note, what comes next? Well, I envision two potential scenarios: the end of Yemen or the end of the Houthis. The two cannot coexist. First, the end of Yemen. I'm not trying to be an alarmist, but if nothing is done to push back the Houthis, it is inevitable that Yemen will cease to exist. Already the parts of the country have fallen victim to the Houthis, are starved of food and education and basic freedoms that we all enjoy here, that Europeans we enjoy here in Italy. This is as contagious as the Houthis are themselves. And it is the fate of the rest of Yemen if drastic international action is not taken. Now to the alternative scenario, the end of the Houthis. Since most people would be loath to watch Yemen vanish into the annals of history, focus then must turn to neutralizing the Houthis. They're not an alternative system of governance. They are an insurgency group seeking to undermine Yemen's fragile society in order to destabilize the region, so Iran can again extend its reach, its tentacles across the entire region. It already has staging grounds against Israel, its other main regional enemy, and now it wants the same for Saudi Arabia. But waging war against the Houthi insurgency and working to end their indiscriminate violence against Yemen's civilian population should not be left to Yemen's depleted military or Saudi Arabia's air force. It must be an international effort to deal with this international challenge. When all is said and done, Yemen is just another war zone in a world of great turbulence. However, neglecting the human cost of the violence that is being enacted by the Houthi insurgency will remain a black spot on humanity as long as it goes unaddressed. We hear it too often. Countless European politicians, American politicians take to the floor of their respective legislative chambers, preaching human rights and values and the importance of a free society, while turning a blind eye to this barbarism that is going on day to day at the hands of the Houthis in Yemen. In closing, I did not come here with many answers, only with a plea for the international community to stop engaging with terrorists and the states that support them. And on that, I thank you for your time and very much look forward to hearing from your other distinguished speakers. Thank you again for the kind invitation.
Thank you, Mr. Matthew, for explaining the dangers of the Houthis movement and how the Biden's administrations deal with the Yemeni issues or the Yemeni case. And thank you for explaining the key problems that happened in Yemen and related to the Yemen case. And we wish that the Biden's administrations redesignate Houthis as a terrorist organization. We move to another speaker, that Ms. Adil Nazirin, that the media fellow of the Gulf Institute for International Strategy.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. It's really an honor and a pleasure to see so many familiar faces and new faces, friends, old and new. And I want to thank everyone for your continued efforts and your commitment to really a very honorable cause, which is to see freedom for the people of Yemen. I want to start off by saying that the international social contract that's enshrined in people's evolving minds, really, since the dawn of time, requires taking a holistic approach to security affairs. It requires compassionate dialogue through whatever form is centered on the fundamental freedoms and prosperity that are the true indicators of a democratic society, and also what is truly at the center and core of what will determine a free society and what is in the best interest of the people. For millions of people throughout the world, 2022 represents hope. There's a sense of light overcoming darkness. And with the advent of innovative technologies that have the ability to equalize the playing field for people throughout our globe, it seems as if this long-awaited opportunity to lift humankind up and raise them from the clutches of suffering has finally arrived. Yet in nations like Yemen, this is a far cry from reality still, and it's still a very distant dream. Of course, the situation having become worse since the 2014 conflict began. And this is especially true for the women there. It's really difficult to imagine that in our 21st century, the struggles women face throughout parts of the world, and especially in Yemen, are really unchanged from hundreds of years ago. The average person in Yemen, of course, suffers from a lack of basic necessities like electricity, running water, let alone heated water. These are everyday luxuries really that we have, and they're just something that individuals in Yemen don't even have access to. Of course, there's the fact that 80% of Yemen's population is so reliant on and survives on aid. The population is facing hunger. Parents are faced with the heart-wrenching decision of having to choose between feeding their children, and getting life-saving medicine to save one of their children who maybe has cholera. And it's a decision that I hope none of us here will ever have to face. I'm sure that each of us here, though, especially with our Yemeni friends, know individuals who have had to face such decisions. And of course, there's 3.6 million, according to estimates, internally displaced people in Yemen. That number is likely far higher due to the lack of accurate reporting and information and access to information. in the country. On top of all of this, Yemen is the worst place in the world, one of the worst places in the world to be female. It's a nation that has been, of course, ripped to pieces by terrorism, civil war, famine. Yemen ranks at the bottom of the global gender gap index, and women are the most vulnerable amongst the population there. Women are heavily and almost exclusively reliant on the men. And when these men are to be breadwinners, and when these men are called to war, as is the case so frequently now and continuously, many of them die, and their dependents then go their dependents are then gone as well, and they are forced to become the breadwinners. But of course, that's a very, very difficult thing to navigate, considering women are not equal in Yemen society culturally, and they have to operate in a society where there are fewer job opportunities for them, considering the gender gap. In fact, Yemen has the widest gender gap in the world, with remuneration for men being far higher than it is for women. Sadly, also, in addition to this, women are seen as financial burdens on their families, which results in an onslaught of underage marriages. There is no minimum age for marriage in Yemen, and the war has only increased the incidence of marriages for girls under the age of 18. There was a story that I knew of more recently, that a girl who was at the age of 9 for $200 sold to a man who was much older than her. And they agreed that because they were dying of starvation and they needed to have access to food and access to all these different things that are essential for survival. And she was not supposed to go live with him until the age of 15, but at the age of, I think, 10 or 11, he said he wanted to come and claim his bride. And they had to bring the police, the local police had to get involved. And they said that according to the contract, that this is true. And the only way to prevent this from happening is if the family would pay the man back in full. And they're a very poor family. They couldn't afford it. It was the equivalent, I think, $40 US dollars a month. So, of course, we have these wrenching stories that leave a scar, leave a mark, and they should be reminded, people should be reminded of what it's like in Yemen, because that will help also create more mindful policy and diplomacy and talks when negotiating with multiple parties that are obviously involved in that region, in that country, outside forces, especially with the US taking a lead on this, which is very important. Sexual violence against women is also very predominant, and it's only worsened. There's a lot of horrific treatment that occurs with women, against women who are in Houthi-run prisons, which all of us here are very familiar with. The detained women there in these Houthi prisons in particular have been subjected to all types of physical torture, beaten with sticks, electrocuted with wires, slapped, strangled, suffocated, drowned in water. And then there's the moral degradation that also ensues, and including rape. And just last year, a collective of human rights groups documented over 1,200, this is documented violations committed by, of course, the Houthi rebels against women, including the aforementioned crimes. Again, that number is most likely higher. There's also the issue of the Sham Trials that are conducted by the Houthis, and these women are imprisoned in large numbers. Many of them are activists, and these charges are really trumped up charges, many of which are fabricated. And these are, for all intents and purposes, very much similar to incidents that occur, sham trials that occur in other countries. Unfortunately, every country has its ups and downs, but one of the countries where these cues are learned from happens to be in Iran as well. I want to say that in 2015, within a 6-month period, a 6-month span alone, sexual or gender-based violence against women in Yemen increased by 70%. That same year, it was estimated that only 55% of women in Yemen were literate, compared to 85% of men. And again, that was 2015. We're in 2022 now. That was within a 6-month span. And I want to say this has absolutely only become worse. And if there was an independent fact-finding mission on the ground in Yemen to actually delve into this, I think the numbers would be astounding. And of course, in war-torn Yemen, there is a lack of investigation and accountability for violence against women. And I will also point to something that is very important to raise awareness about is there are checkpoints, of course, that are required. And there is a strict adherence with both male and female officers to what's called the mahram system. And that requires for a woman to be accompanied by a male relative while in public. And there's the male representative being there is a very challenging thing, being there are so many men in families who are taken into the clasps of this war, and they're often killed, they are taken prisoner. And what happens when these women are left with only female households after the men are gone because of certain incidents? Their ability to travel from point to point becomes very challenging, and it's a burden. And these unprotected women don't have too much of a choice. But it's important to note that despite all the hardship and all the mistreatment that women undergo in Yemen in its current situation, which unless definitive action and talks and a holistic approach and a thoughtful approach is really implemented, things don't seem to be changing. Women play, as we all know, a critically important role in protecting their fellow countrymen and women. I just want to point out that in Aden, for example, there is a group of women who are being trained. It's an all-women military group that is focused on eliminating terrorists and protecting their society there. And these women, for example, to silver lining, have found a way to rise above their traditional roles in the conservative society within which they live. This is just one of many tangible examples. And I also want to point to one woman in particular who you may have heard of. Her name is Ishraq al-Makhtari. She was one of the first women to join the revolution in the streets of Yemen in 2011. She was one of hundreds of brave women who played an important role in what is known as Yemen's Arab Spring. That was that was in 2011, mind you, okay, 11 years ago. That was one of the first forays women led into voicing and demonstrating the need for their place in civil society and shaping the nation's future of governance. And there are there are thousands, I'm certain, of women like Ishraq in Yemen. And what they need is to have the opportunity, right? It is only when women are involved in the process that Yemen will have an actual shot at true democracy and peace, at least semblance to it. Every nation goes through its period of peace. If you look at many books have been written about this, economists, there's eras of peace and eras of war in every nation, ebbs and flows. Yemen has not known peace for a very long time. And I can also say probably not since anyone here can recall. But women really hardly have any representation in the negotiations process in the current Yemen conflict. And I think this is something that also has to be addressed. Women do have to have a place at the table in these negotiation processes. Yemen's greatest resource truly is its women. They hold the country together on a civil society and familial level. And despite the darkness, there is optimism for the next generation, but only with a realistic political framework towards peace in Yemen that includes women will this be achievable. And they must have a seat at the table. And that is something that I look forward to seeing, because if this situation continues as it is, without having women have an active and powerful and important presence and role in this process, then Yemen will continue down this trajectory until there's really no one left to carry on the burden. And that's not what any of us want to see here. So thank you for having me here. And I look forward to seeing women more involved in this process of bringing Yemen back to the place where it deserves to be for the women and for everyone else living there.
Thank you, Adel, and glad to see you again. Also, millions of the people around the world thought that 2022 represent the hope. As you said, there is a light overcoming darkness, but not, unfortunately, not for the Yemeni people, especially the Yemeni women. Yemen is the one of the worst place in the world to be a female, as Miss Adel mentioned, a nation that has been wrapped to pieces by terrorist, civil war, and famine. 80% of Yemeni populations survives on aid. 70% of population is facing the hunger. And thank you for mentioning how Houthis militias treat the women, especially the Intisar al-Hamadi. We have not to forget her. She is now judged 5 years because of the Houthis illegal court, and how Yemeni women are subjected to all kind of violations by the Houthis militia. We move to another speaker, that Professor Adrian Kalamil, the Middle Eastern historian and terrorist scholar.
Thank you, Bassem, and it was great hearing Adele and Matthew both speak on their topics. For myself, I will be speaking on the Houthis, Hezbollah, and terrorism. And generally, thank you once again for inviting me to speak on this very interesting and complex topic. One I've been following for years in relation to the Houthis and the regional backers. In broad terms, what I'll be doing is I'll split this up into two topics: why the Houthis are a terrorist organization, and absolutely they are. They should be on the foreign terrorist organization list, which they were taken off, which Matthew alluded to. And then also look at the level of support they've been receiving from Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran over the years. So first of all, Houthis, are they terrorists? It may seem difficult at times to kind of understand what constitutes terrorism because the lines have become blurred, sometimes deliberately to justify terrorism, but it really shouldn't be that difficult if you analyze three simple rules. In our case, are the Houthi actions politically motivated? Do they have a history of deliberately attacking civilian targets to create casualties? And finally, have they terrorized the masses? And I think if we can look at that, we can say yes to all three of those. Yemen has been a humanitarian disaster for over a decade, but received very little media coverage. However, at the basic level, we do know the Houthis have cleared cities by shelling civilian populations with Scud missile variants, a terrorist act, plain and simple, any way you look at it. During the rapid advance through the country over the last year, kind of coinciding with them being taken off the FTO list, they have committed multiple war crimes, including use of child soldiers, capturing women as sex slaves, and using civilian populations as human shields to protect their arsenals. Darkness has completely descended on Yemen, with little to no reporting on terrorist acts being perpetrated by Houthis with their stranglehold on the nation. On the other hand, Houthi terrorist acts outside of Yemen been a little easier to chronicle. Just looking at the numbers from 2018 to the present, the Houthis have launched 430 missiles and 850 drones against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Some have targeted the Saudi economic infrastructure, such as oil pipelines and facilities, while many have been intercepted by the non-lethal Patriot battery systems supplied by the United States. However, a good number of the attempted and successful terrorist attacks from missiles and drones have been targeting commercial centers, airports, heavily populated areas, resulting in 52 deaths and many more wounded. The Houthis most recently fired missiles and launched suicide drones against the United Arab Emirates, first striking Abu Dhabi International Airport, killing 3 and injuring another 6 on January 17th. After the first strike, the UAE requested the US State Department put the Houthis back on the foreign terrorist organization list, one they were removed from in February of last year by Secretary of State Tony Blinken. 7 days later, on January 24th, the Houthis made more attempts to create carnage at the airport, but air defense systems took the missiles and drones out of the sky. Then again, on January 31st, 7 days after the last attack on the airport that was intercepted, the Houthis launched another barrage at the airport. This attack just happened to coincide with Israel President Herzog's trip to the Gulf state on the 31st, where he flew into Abu Dhabi Airport, a mission to strengthen bilateral relations between the Abraham Accord signatories. Clearly, the Houthis are a terrorist organization, and they were trained and equipped by the masters sitting in Tehran and Beirut. So let's examine that relationship now. If you look at this relationship, well, let's start it off with a quote. In 2019, an Iranian hardline newspaper stated, "The battle in the South has become one of its most successful campaigns across the Middle East." And when he said the battle in the South, he was referring to Yemen. When analyzing the Houthis' advance through Yemen, it is clear they have been receiving material aid and support from the Islamic Republic of Iran and its premier proxy, Hezbollah. At some point, the Houthis must be wondering if they are just useful idiots. Their control of Yemen fits Tehran's grand design of creating a Shia crescent that can threaten the Gulf states and Israel. In addition, under Houthi control, the Islamic Republic has the ability to threaten down international shipping through the Suez, down the Red Sea, and out through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. For our purpose, the question is how the Houthis coordinate with Tehran and Hezbollah. And quite frankly, they follow a typical pattern wherever the Islamic Republic wants to sow chaos and grow its influence. At a macro level, Tehran provides the weapons and mobilizes Lebanese Hezbollah for training the Houthis. The weapons are typically shipped out of Iranian naval base at Bandar Abbas near the Strait of Hormuz and travel a short distance to Yemen, where they are offloaded to the Houthis. However, as the Houthis gobble up more territory, including international airport at Sana'a, it is very likely that weapons have been moved with airplanes, specifically Air Mahan, also known as Aero Terror, because of their frequent flights to Venezuela and supplying terrorist means and materials. Initially, the weapons included the usual small arms, rocket-propelled grenades, and a variant of unsophisticated Scud missiles that can do damage, but there's a lot of collateral damage with them. Over the last 3 years, we have seen a shift where Tehran's proxies have been utilizing a more sophisticated or smart weapon that is low cost for terror operations, and that's the explosive-laden suicide drone. As far as strategic coordination between the Houthis and Tehran, many analysts and policymakers have been downplaying the role of Tehran, disconnecting the dots between the state sponsor and its proxy terrorist organization. The fact is, Tehran will have several operatives from the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force, or IRGC QF, assisting with strategy in Yemen at any given time. Furthermore, any individuals posted to Sana'a in a diplomatic capacity will play some role in assisting the Houthis and are likely a member of the IRGC or Ministry of Intelligence Services, or MOIS. It was alleged the Iranian ambassador to Yemen, who recently died of COVID in December, was courting the siege of Marib. On the ground, the much larger presence helping the Houthis take territory is Lebanese Hezbollah, an organization that is essentially an extension of the IRGC Quds Force. Moving on to Hezbollah and in Yemen, unlike Syria, where projections put Hezbollah losses at a third of its fighting force, they have not been directly involved in the fighting in Yemen. Hezbollah has taken its more traditional approach of working in the shadows, behind the scenes in an advisory and training capacity. Houthis that show particular promise or value for Tehran or Hezbollah are sent to Iran or Lebanon for advanced training in espionage, surveillance, explosives trainings, etc. Inside Yemen, Hezbollah trains the Houthis in small and medium arms fire, explosives, battlefield strategy, and actually recently video has surfaced of Hezbollah training Houthis how to weaponize drones at the Sana'a International Airport. War crimes such as using human shields to protect weapons stockpiles is a common characteristic practiced by both Hezbollah and, for its part, Iran, which has placed nuclear sites such as Fordo next to large civilian centers. Both Tehran and Hezbollah still deny any involvement with helping the Houthis, but the Houthis have no problem making claims of responsibility when they hit targets with Tehran-made and Hezbollah-modified drones and missiles. Yemen and the Houthis have been a low-cost success for the Islamic Republic. They have not lost blood and not spent a lot of money. On the surface, it may seem like a short-term project, which Tehran quickly capitalized on. But the relationship has been developed for close to 3 decades, with the Houthi delegation traveling to Tehran as early as 1993, 1994. So Tehran was trying to woo them back in 1994. In 1994, the Houthis were an irrelevant player in the political landscape of Yemen that had just been unified. But with material aid from the Islamic Republic and Hezbollah trainers on the ground, they have seized control of the country. Tehran played the long game. They saw a weak, fragmented country teetering towards a failed state that eventually fell into a civil war, with the proxy being the most cohesive force that could take control of Yemen. At some point in time, it is difficult to see any other outcome. At this point in time, it is difficult to see any other outcome than a Houthi-controlled Yemen that is already and will become increasingly beholden to the Islamic Republic of Iran. At some point, the Houthis have to govern, and in an oil-poor, war-ravaged country with no economic backbone, they will cede more influence to Tehran through financial dependence, the same way that it was done to garner influence over Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and now Yemen. Thank you for letting me share on these comments. If you have any questions, these are complex topics, and the Hezbollah and IRGC order of battle and the interplay between this very successful proxy in Yemen is a very, very complex topic. But they are terrorist organizations, and they have been getting help all along from these groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Adrian, and thank you for explaining and how to analyze the Houthis' advance through the Yemen. It is clear that they have been receiving material aid and supporting from the Islamic Republic of Iran and its premier proxy, Hezbollah. And thank you for also explaining the aim of the Iranian country that under Houthi control, the Islamic Republic of Iran has the ability to threaten the international shipping traveling through the Suez down to the Red Sea and out through the Bab al-Mandab Strait. Thank you very much. Is there any questions to the speakers? I have actually a questions to you all that how the European and the American media deals with the Yemeni issue. We cannot we don't see too many articles and videos that talking about the crimes and the violations committed by Houthis militia. What do you think? Why the media doesn't explain to the people in the Europa and America about the Houthis violations? And it's clear with the all evidence.
If I may quickly opine on that, it's very difficult because of the lack of transparency and the dangers that journalists face, not only in, outside of America, of course, but especially in countries like Yemen, where there are so many outside factions and, the Houthi militias. And of course, you have the inter-fighting between the different government factions as well, and the opposition forces. And so oftentimes journalists are taken to prison. They are imprisoned and tortured for voicing their opinions. Everything is very controlled and monitored there. And anyone who speaks out against the current situation will be persecuted and punished for it. And so journalists are very, very fearful, and they don't have the freedom to be able to speak. And that's why it's so important to have publications that are more open source. There's one that I know of, for example, called the Daily Middle East, that's going to be published in the next few weeks. And it's an open source platform, and it's going to be available for everyone. And it's a matter of getting the truth out there and allowing for the people within Yemen and within other parts of the world to be able to see what the situation is there. And I hope this will be one such platform that will help alleviate that situation a little bit more. But again, until there's more, again, women at the table, and until there's more of a diplomatic process that will include having members of Yemeni civil society at the table to discuss this, we're not going to see much more in terms of journalistic accountability either.
Yeah, I'll also say that even before the Houthi advance, I mean, you go back to the Arab Spring, if you want to call it the Arab Spring. Yemen got very little attention, even after the fact, when it kind of fell into a civil war and everything. It was just kind of out of sight, out of mind, and everybody's eyes were set on Syria. Everybody's eyes were set on what's going on in Syria, and then there's been multiple things going on since. And unfortunately, I do think that there is a certain type of, I don't know, people are hesitant to cover the Houthis to a certain degree. I don't want to say because of their linkage to Iran and all this nonsense with making a nuclear deal, but I think people see Yemen and they say they have trouble connecting the dots, or news, it's too much of a news story, and Americans won't be able to grasp it. But if you put it in really simple terms, that some of the atrocities that they're committing, I think more people would pay attention. But unfortunately, you don't see a lot of that coming out and a lot being written about it.
Thank you. And just on that, I'd like to flip the question somewhat from a European perspective. I think we need to look at the political conversation that's ongoing domestically. I mean, you see, especially in the European Parliament, far more attention given in parliamentary human rights urgency resolutions to Gulf countries, even smaller Gulf countries like Bahrain and the Emirates, with little comparative attention to the barbarism of the Houthis in Yemen. In fact, I think one of the last times that a resolution was even framed that addressed Yemen, it took more aim at Saudi Arabia's actions than the action of the Houthis themselves. So I think the European media often maybe subconsciously frames the debate using these existing political narratives. So I think we need to, as opinion formers here, I think we need to push our leaders, our politicians, to reshape the debate somewhat. And I think, what Adrian said is hit the nail on the head. Out of sight, it's sadly out of sight, out of mind, because it's not being debated and spoken to as it should in our European legislative chambers, at the heart of decision making. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for the very important answers from your sides, the speakers. Is there any questions from the participants? No.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
My question is, honestly, through what we are seeing from the Houthi is building a new action every day. He's doing something like making children soldiers. He's fighting now against the Saudi Arabia and sending missiles to Abha and etc. Do you think there is a way that the United States of America is gonna go through this with a serious action, or we're gonna stay like that for other many years and someone else gonna protect Houthi from those actions? Thank you.
Thank you, Nasser.
I'll put in my 2 cents on this. With this administration being so wedded to making some type of deal with the Islamic Republic, that's why the Houthis were taken off the foreign terrorist organization list in the first place, is my belief. I do not believe that you will see any pushback against the Houthis for at least the next 3 years. You'll hear condemnations, you'll hear strong language, but you won't hear anything else. And as Matthew pointed out, this administration seems more, it seems more content about going after Saudi Arabia in a conflict like this. They will side with the Qatari angle or some of the other malign actors, but they don't want to upset the Islamic Republic. And if they upset the Islamic Republic, then this, and you also have to remember they want to, and I don't know how they can possibly do this because they've shown weakness all over the world, starting with Afghanistan, but they want to pivot to great power competition, which is China and Russia. If you can't handle the Taliban and you're having trouble with dealing with the Islamic Republic, Houthis, etc., how can you shift to great power competition? So we'll see what happens, but I'm not hopeful. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you for answering, Prof. Adrian. Thank you very much for the great event, the valuable papers. We are closing the event today. Or wish you all a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you so
me.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.